Well,
Yes.
hello. This is David Sloan Wilson for This View of Life, the podcast that explores anything and everything from an evolutionary perspective. And I'm so happy to be interviewing you, Graham Boyd. Welcome to the TVOL podcast.
Thank you, David. It is fantastic to be here. I'm looking forward to another of our typically entertaining, wide ranging, and deep thought kind of conversations.
Yes, we've had a few private conversations or in small groups. Now we get a chance to talk in public. And the reason I'm so interested in it is that I see us, the two of us, as representative of long-term historical trends having to do with complex system science and evolutionary science. These two bodies of thought as young, mostly developing within the last 50 years. I want to explore that. I want to add a historical dimension to this. Complementary, both essential and complementary, but the integration very much still a work in progress, very much still a work in progress. And so I think the integration that we can achieve as two individuals can really help to catalyze the integration more generally between the evolutionary science community and the complex system science community. So all of that is what I want to to cover. And to begin, why don't you just very briefly introduce yourself? Another point I'll make that we share in common is that we have an academic background, but we're also both of us very much engaged in real world change efforts. And so we're applying our knowledge, and it is very important for both of us to do so. If we're not putting this into action, then we really haven't succeeded yet. So with that in mind, please introduce yourself to our audience. Some will already know you, but not everyone.
Yes, excellent. Thank you, David. So I'd characterize myself as the two legs that I stand on. The one leg I stand on is a very, very high level of curiosity. I really need to know and understand how things work, why are things the way they are. And that couples with the second leg, which is a high level of creativity. All of my life, I've been taking things apart to understand how they work, creating new things with what I've taken apart, and the two to come together in what's really the red thread running through all of my life, which is creating something that is transcending and including what we have today so that we can solve whatever problems have emerged with today's thinking by shifting gear to a higher level of thinking that transcends and includes. A bit like in analogy to that quotation from Rumi of there is a field beyond right and wrong. Let's meet there. And I keep
Mm-hmm.
thinking there's a field beyond your discipline versus my discipline, or your way of thinking versus my way of thinking. There's a field beyond that. Let's meet there. And I'll put in a couple more bits about my background. So I was born in Africa, grew up in apartheid South Africa, and this experience of growing up on the beneficial side of a fundamentally unjust system, lacking the power to really do anything significant to change it. And what I've learned from how apartheid came to an end, that deeply informs everything I'm doing. The other leg is my first career, as you said, was in academia, particle physics theory. And I did my PhD and then spent another 4 years as a researcher at different universities around the world, Germany, Italy, and Japan. Then I moved to Procter and Gamble because it had become clear to me I was too much of a practitioner to only work in academia. Joined P&G with the intent of really being part of a company whose purpose is to improve the lives of the world's consumers. Left P&G in 2008 at a point where it had become both very clear that the climate crisis was already starting to happen, and frustrated at how slowly and limited was P&G's ability to respond. And so since 2008, I've been asking myself the question and coming up with answers to it of what is it in our current structures, structured interactions, and paradigm that is holding good people, good companies back from really doing what they know the world needs us to do.
Excellent. Perfect. Okay. Well, now, with that in mind, I should also say that just last week you had a podcast with Steve Keen and friends, which was very informative. I was very happy to listen to it. And so we'll put that in the liner notes. I might refer to that podcast, making sure that we get the context for our current audience. Also, I'm going to refer to some articles and papers which our audience has not read, but we have. And of course, I can provide links in the show notes so that this conversation can really be a kind of a master class or a tutorial for our audience. So one thing that I've found myself saying is that the last 50 years is more than 10% of the scientific revolution. So if the scientific revolution is 500 years old, what's been taking place in the last 50 years is foundational, not just the tail end of the scientific revolution, because of two bodies of knowledge, complex system science and evolutionary science, both amazingly young in some sense. Of course, they have roots, but amazingly young in some sense. And what I'd like to do is actually elaborate on that for complex system science, which is your field, but to actually give my rendition of it, which I can do quite quickly. And then to have you comment on that so we can establish like the recency of complex system science and that we can agree with each other. And then repeat for evolutionary science. So what I have to say about complex system science is, in the first place, the world is complex, and that when we're trying to describe that and understand that in words, it's easy to celebrate rich interconnectedness in words because it's what we experience. But if we want to go beyond words and model complex systems more formally, until the advent of widespread computing, we were more or less stuck with mathematical models. And although mathematical models are powerful, in fact, for those who do them, and you, which includes both of us, there's a kind of a de facto denial of complexity because a model really cannot handle more than 2 or 3 variables if they're interacting nonlinearly. There's all these simplifying assumptions that you have to make in order to do a mathematical model. And frankly, the same is true with an experiment. With an empirical experiment, you have to hold everything constant except 1 or 2 or 3 variables. And so that also is a de facto denial of complexity. And so the whole development of our thinking about systems in general, complex or otherwise, you might say has been constrained by the limitations of formal mathematical models, closed form, proofs and so on, and empirical research. And so what happened 50 years ago, of course, was the advent of widespread computing. And there we have now a whole new set of tools for various sorts of simulations. And of course, they remain mathematical, but rather than offering like general proofs, they basically allow an exploration of a very complex parameter space. And one of my portals to this was the book Chaos by James Gleick, which I think is one of the very best books for a popular science audience. A lot of people learned about the science of complexity through that book, and I was among them. And so that more or less explains why complex system science is new. Really, of course, it has roots, but couldn't really come into its own before the advent of computing. So I like to say Gleick's book was published in 1987, and And the Santa Fe Institute, which is known for this kind of work, was established in 1984. And so that just demonstrates the recency. So much of what we know about complex systems we only learned during the last 50 years. So that's how I understand it. And I'm dying to know, because this is your area, not mine, whether you agree with this or would like to elaborate on it, or so please take your turn.
Great. So I I will agree with it and I will elaborate on it and I'll disagree with it.
Okay.
And what I'll put in here in terms of when I say agree and disagree, one of the things that is deep inside systems thinking, that is deep inside many of the religions or spiritual traditions, is the recognition that if this is a truth, the opposite to a truth can both be a falsehood as well as another equally deep truth that in some sense is in opposition. And so this runs through the heart of modern physics. Quantum mechanics emerged because of the recognition that whilst in classical physics a wave and a particle were completely distinct things and it was an either or choice, in the quantum world the wave and the particle were two complementary dimensions that came together, and that an electron was both a wave and a particle. Which one you saw depended on which dimension you were looking at. And so in what you were saying, I would say that what you were saying is certainly true. Certainly what you were saying around the role of computers, many things have changed over the past 50 years. On my side in fundamental particle physics, I was running on some of the world's fastest supercomputers at the time I was doing my research. And that enabled us to do calculations with many, many variables from the ground up, bottom up calculations
Right.
straight from the differential equations. Nobody could have done those even 10 years before I started my research work, because even then the computers were not actually fast enough to do anything worth doing.
Yeah.
Now, what's emerging there is my sense, and I think this will set us up for the next stage of where we go in the conversation. Everybody knows that physics is in some sense foundational, and chemistry in some sense emerges from physics, and the biochemical processes in living organisms emerge from fundamental chemistry. And there's a naive thinking that says, well, if we just understood the physics well enough and could calculate properly, in other words, if we try harder, we'll get there, then we can derive everything we see in chemistry. And if we get that right, we can derive everything we see in living biology, all the way up to the entire biosphere and wisdom and consciousness, etc. So whilst that is in principle true, and maybe one day we'll get there, after all, the universe does that as an analog computer, if you want to call it that. What's missing in that way of thinking is emergent phenomena. There is something fundamental and qualitatively different between particle physics, chemistry, molecular biology, the chemistry of life. At each layer of complexity, completely new phenomena emerge that are not in any way linearly derivable from the previous layer.
Yeah.
And one of the key things, and I'll put this bit in and then I'll pause. One of the key things is Actually, when I use the word ecosystem as distinct to system, what I'm emphasizing there is the complementarity of the system and the flows, the interactions, the agency. That in an ecosystem, the two of them are quite distinct and inseparable. And if you think of the system of a river, you think of the riverbed, and that's your system. But that as an ecosystem is completely different depending on whether it's dry, filled with water up to half capacity, or overflowing, attempting to carry 10 times the system flow capacity. All three of those are completely different when you look at everything together. New phenomena emerge. And I think that's the key question. This connectivity, this inseparability and distinction between the systems and the interactions. And that's part of what drives a lot of the emergence, I suspect, in multi-level selection and your field of expertise.
Yeah, well, thank you, Graham. And let me cover that same ground. First, I'm happy that I'm glad that you brought in spiritual traditions and religious traditions as often very systemic. Buddhism among them, very systemically oriented, and um, and also I think indigenous knowledge systems are also very systemic, in part because they cannot afford to be reductionistic. I think reductionism is a kind of a luxury that most societies can't afford. They don't have causal understanding. They won't anytime soon. And so they're much more designed around pattern recognition and so on, that we could learn a lot from. And at the same time, those are expressed in words and so on, and they don't substitute for scientific understanding. And then what you said about reductionism, also true. And there's a nice philosophical literature on this, including an article by my wonderful friend and colleague Elliot Sober. And that article begins along the lines of, if there is a received view among philosophers about reductionism, it is that reductionism is mistaken. And so the idea that you could reduce everything to, the lowest level, and that's somehow a more fundamental, no, not even for physical systems before we get to evolution. And so these higher levels of description have their own legitimacy and autonomy, um, you might say. And as you were talking, I was thinking of some of my favorite examples of what I like to call the complexity wall. Um, One is the two-body problem transitioning to the three-body problem in physics. So two-body problem, very easy to model with equations. Three-body problem, well, you could model it with equations, but there's not much good because everything, the trajectory of the system depends on initial conditions, so on and so forth, before we even get to many bodies. In population genetics, single locus models, piece of cake. Two locus models, okay. But as soon as you get to multi-locus models with interaction effects and environmental effects, frequency dependence, density dependence, all that, forget about it. And so, and then there's the jointed pendulum, and I encourage our readers to just look up jointed pendulum and see what happens when you have just a pendulum on a rigid stick, just swings back and forth, and then you put in one or two joints, and you see that it traces this wonderful artwork, basically, its trajectory. And if you displace it, the initial conditions, an infinitesimal amount, you get a completely different picture. And so that complexity wall, um, you reach it so very soon, and beyond which you just need other methods, and that's where your computer simulations that take weeks on the world's fastest computers uh, come in. If I understand you correctly. So let's see where I want to go um, from here. Well, maybe I should go now to revolution. Is that okay? Is that a good thing to do?
May I just put in one build on what you've said?
Sure.
The One of the things that I have found very helpful in all of my recent work is a simple statement from Taoism. The Tao that you can name is not the Tao. And
Right.
that for me captures what we're talking about with the flaws in reductionism. Yes, it's helpful to do reductionism, to name what you can name and categorize and understand what you can, but not to fall into the trap of believing that you can do that with everything. There is inherent unknowability,
Yeah.
and whatever you think you know, actually, no, you don't know it. So, yeah, I just wanted to put that in as a build on what
Yeah,
you were saying.
totally. I have a very long print conversation with Brother Phop Lin, who's one of the senior monks of Plum Village. It's titled "Science, Spirituality, Science, and Action." How are those three words, spirituality, science, and action, put together in Buddhism, engaged Buddhism, and in evolution? And how do they compare? But that conversation begins with Brother Phop Lin making that same point about language, that as soon as we think we understand something, we don't. And language is as a trap in addition to an enabler. We can't do without it, but at the same time, it just excludes so much. As soon as we think about something a certain way, then that's a very, very, very limited view compared to the actual world. And I think that maps very well onto evolution and cultural evolution and much. I mean, we could take off on that. So yeah. So if you, what was the way you put it? If you think you
The,
understand the Tao, you don't.
yeah, the Tao that you can name is not the Tao.
Yeah, yeah. And I think
Yes.
one of the things that does is it uh, demands humility,
Yes.
and that's a good thing because I think scientists are often accused of hubris,
Mm.
and often they're found guilty. so so hubris is a, and often when you proclaim the wonders of science, then that seems like a form of hubris. But to proclaim the wonders of scientific knowledge, objective knowledge, and at the same time be humble about it is what's demanded. And it's like other virtues. We can strive towards it, but we even, you know, seldom get there completely. But it is good to hold it up as one of the great virtues. Is to be, if you're a scientist, you need to be humble about. But you also need to be assertive about what you do know, because if there's not something that we're willing to call facts, at least based on their current knowledge, then we're in this void of ignorance. And this void
Yes.
of ignorance. And nowadays, with fake truth and all of this, you know, conspiracy theories and denial and all of this stuff, I mean, what a hell it is to not have this body of information that we call factual knowledge. The idea of giving that up is just cast us into an abyss of
Mm.
special interests and this is not what we want. So that's the sense in which scientific knowledge is sacred, and we need to be humble about. And here we're using religious language, aren't we? So I think that it's so interesting to be able to say, to speak in religious terms about science, and to do that authentically is part of the big picture that we're striving for. I think we're maybe straying a little bit from what I have in mind for this conversation, but no harm in that.
No
But
harm. Maybe if I can put in one build on what you've just said and then let's change gear. In terms of facts and science and what is science, a lot of people tend to think that science is a study of the facts and that what science says the world is the absolute truth. And actually, I much prefer Niels Bohr's definition of science as a study of what we can say about what is. Science is really about language and numbers and descriptions of the world rather than actually attempting to study what really is. And that for me is, I think, very helpful in maintaining a level of humility. If you're saying, well, science is helping me get better and better at talking about the world in ways that more and more closely capture more and more of what the world is, but with full recognition that I will never capture everything, and there may be another layer that my words and numbers just are not even capable of seeing at the moment. You know, so that I just wanted to put that definition in that it may be helpful for people.
It is helpful, and I think it's great. I have no quarrel with it, except um, I think there's a folk level of description that I sometimes feel we don't want to abandon. A statement such as mountains existed before people. Can we call that a fact? Can we please do that? Do we have to declare humility about something like that? If you're investigating a murder and the DNA evidence comes in or the murder weapon is found, and so Mrs. Peacock did it with a wrench in the kitchen. Can we just say that? Do we have to go on and on about how provisional our knowledge is? I feel like we both of those can go together, but I sometimes feel we just become a little bit too hypersensitive about making the point. We just have to strive for that balance, and
Yes.
uh,
Very much agree with you. And especially once we've established through lots of experiments, etc., that this is what we can say about how the world works,
yeah,
any claim that we can say something different has to come with an incredibly high standard of evidence
yeah,
about that.
yeah,
And invariably in science, what happens is all that claim can do is put a boundary on just how far we can say that. And beyond that boundary, we say something else. Classical mechanics is still what is used for almost everything that we do in modern civilization.
right,
We only need quantum mechanics for a few things at this small end, and general relativity and special relativity for the big end of the cosmos. But there's not much in our economy that needs general relativity. Okay, there's quite a lot more that needs quantum mechanics, GPS, computers, cell phones need
yeah,
it. But our day-to-day experience is still completely perfectly described by classical mechanics.
yeah. So all good. So now let me speak for a few minutes on evolution. Now, in some ways, it's 165 years old, if I calculated correctly, from the origin of species. That's not new. And I think what made Darwin's and Wallace's theory of natural selection stunning at the time, today we call it ultimate causation, distinguished from proximate causation, but it's explaining the properties of organisms not on the basis of their physical makeup, but on the basis of the shaping influence of selection. And that, so natural selection, everyone knows it. I mean, not everyone, but just to remind everyone, 3 ingredients, variation. Organisms vary in just about everything that could be measured about them. Selection. Those differences often make a difference in terms of survival and reproduction, replication. Traits tend to be transmitted from parents to offspring. And the replication part, the concept of heritability, just the very fact that offspring resemble parents without knowing why. So heritability always has a mechanistic basis. You never get away from that. Evolution is a physical, historical process. Everything that evolves has a historical basis. But to the degree that the materials result in heritable variation, that's the degree to which the materials can be ignored. In just the same way as that when we look at a sculpture, mostly we see the shaping influence of the sculptor, and the properties of clay, thankfully, are malleable. So we don't have to think much about the properties of clay. As long as they deliver malleability, then what we see is the shaping influence of the sculptor, so also with natural selection. And so what's called adaptation thinking, natural selection thinking, I've, in my book, Evolution for Everyone, call it a third way of thinking, because without it, what do we have to explain the world? We have physics, we have explaining its physical makeup, we might have a theological explanation, But we didn't have, until Darwin and Wallace came along, this third way of thinking in which we can say, for example, in a desert, we expect a lot of species to have a color that matches their background. And that's going to be true for white deserts, black deserts, tan deserts. It's going to be true for birds, snails, mammals. Amazing. Amazing that we could make a prediction like that without knowing anything, just on the basis of the relationship between the organism and the environment. And we can completely ignore the physical makeup when we operate in that mode. Now, obviously, a richer understanding will require both. And so these are called approximate and ultimate causation. Nico Tinbergen divided it four ways: um, function, history, mechanism, and development. And this is a fully rounded account of evolution. So all of this is, I think, what evolution represents from the very beginning, and what gave Darwin and others this amazing powers of prediction, explanatory scope. Now, the reason that some of this is new is because with the advent of genetics, the study of evolution became restricted almost entirely to genetic evolution. And so Darwin thought more broadly about heritability, not knowing the mechanisms. But once the mechanism of Mendelian genetics was discovered, then what became known as the modern synthesis was almost entirely gene-centric, even to the point that textbooks define natural selection as a change in gene frequency. And so what that left out were such things as, cultural evolution. Now, basically, was eclipsed for 50 years. And so that brings us to the 1970s, when people began to think about what's now known as generalized Darwinism, any mechanism that combines, any process that combines the mechanisms of variation, selection, replication, no matter what the mechanism. That's genetic evolution, epistasis, forms of social learning found in many species, and forms of symbolic thought that are distinctively human. And so what's new is for this theory, which is celebrated for its explanatory scope in the biological sciences, suddenly has become available to all things human. Um, um, every human-related topic, both academic and uh, applied. So that places. That's why both complex system science and evolutionary science are, in some sense, new bodies of knowledge and different from each other, of course, overlapping. And so that is why the last 50 years is more than just 10% of the scientific revolution. So now I think maybe have you comment on that, and then I want to move to multi-level selection, and then that's what's on deck. But first, let me pause and to have you comment on anything you'd like to say about my little piece there on evolution.
Yes, so love what you were saying, very much in agreement with it. I do see this as a third way, complementing physics and theology. And with physics, I'll already say, let me use just physics as a pointer to things like physics, chemistry, and recognizing the complexity that emerges at each successive layer in that. The one thing I wanted to put in, and this may set us up for where we're going, there are a number of different disciplines that began around 150, 160 years ago. One of those was economics, as we know it today. That began back then. And another one was in physics. Around about then, the understanding began be developed in physics of the difference between situations where the physics was completely dominated by individual possibilities and probabilities. In other words, time was a trivial factor versus physics where time was central, and where what you were actually needed to work with in physics was the entire path through time. And it was the path that was the fundamental unit. So if we think of a particle, in quantum mechanics, this is really clear. What really matters is the path that the particle follows, not just the particle at this point in space and time is completely different to the particle at this point in space and time, and you don't need to worry about the path that got it there. No, you actually really need to worry about the path. The path from here to there is what defines the properties here, not you can't ignore it.
Yeah, well, this
And
gets us to ergodicity, one of your favorite words, right?
that's where we're coming to. And it struck me with what you were saying, just as economics did not take into account the fundamental difference between when the path is the fundamental unit versus when the simple probabilities are the fundamental unit, I'm thinking that the same thing is relevant in evolution. Genetics tends to think of it's all about the probabilities of the different genes.
Yeah.
Whereas what you were describing, and where I think Darwin was intuitively centering himself, is actually it's the entire path that is the unit in evolution.
Yeah, that's a fine way of putting it. And I think that it brings us back to the de facto denial of complexity imposed by mathematical modeling. So, I mean, the focus on equilibrium, ergodicity, and so on. Just to grind through the math, you have to make those uh, assumptions. Would you agree with that? And so now we're steeped in non-ergodic systems. We should have known that, but the reason that we departed from that was basically we had to in order to use the tools that we had. And there's a wonderful example, Graham, in the history of population genetics. And the three founders of population genetics are said to be Ronald Fisher, J.B.S. Haldane, and Sewall Wright. And Sewall Wright was a complexity thinker from the very beginning. If you learn about his shifting balance theory, and he assumed that because he was steeped in the animal breeding literature, so he couldn't get away from this. That if you an individual trait, what looks like an individual trait because you could measure it in an individual, in fact, had a very complex genetic basis. Not a simple. It's not blue eyes are caused by blue-eyed genes. No, no, no. Much more complex genetic basis, and also um, um, social interactions. And so that was his starting point in the 1920s. And then, in contrast, Fisher and Haldane were much more simplifiers, and they came up with the whole body of population genetics theory, which has to do with additivity and all these simplifications that became Mendelian genetics. So it's not as if there weren't people back then who appreciated complexity. It's just that in the contest of ideas, the simpler ones won out and had to reveal their limitations, you might say, before the need for what Sewall Wright apprehended from the beginning could actually come into the fore. So I think that happens again and again and again. It's almost like a life cycle of ideas that begins with the simple and then and maybe it's as it should be. I don't know, but here we are for that. Now I wanted to as we go back to the beginning, so that the first and fundamental insights of evolutionary theory, it includes the following. That hold on a minute. Gosh, hold on a minute.
Mm-hmm.
How did that happen? Let me just turn this on. Um, that before Darwin, uh, this piece has to do with functional organization. When can we call something functionally organized? Um, like a single organism. And the pre-Darwinian view, the Christian view, was that as a creation of God, nature is functionally organized from top to bottom, from the smallest insect to the from to the stars in heaven. But when Darwin began to think about this, he realized that actually there was a problem, and that his theory of natural selection could not explain uh, any prosocial behavior, any behavior that whereby individuals benefit others or their group as a whole was difficult to explain. Why? Because natural selection is based on relative fitness, not absolute fitness. It doesn't matter how well an organism survives and reproduces, only that it does so better than other organisms. And so if natural selection is favoring individuals that survive and reproduce better than individuals, then how could it explain behaviors that benefit individuals, others at the expense of the actors? So he had a problem explaining anything that we would call prosocial. But he also perceived the solution, which is that even though selfishness beats altruism within groups, as I put it with Ed Wilson, it's also true that cooperative groups, altruistic, cooperative, prosocial groups that are internally cooperative robustly outcompete groups of individuals who cannot cohere. So the dynamic is selfishness beats altruism within groups. The most local, the smallest scale evolutionary pressures do not favor prosocial behaviors. They favor selfish behaviors. You need to actually have another layer of competition among groups in order to explain cooperation within groups. And of course, that all leaves open the question of how do you explain cooperation among groups. And so the question of when you're entitled to call something cooperative or functionally organized is it depends. It depends. It's not ubiquitous in nature. Special conditions are required. And this message was a long time getting clarified within evolutionary biology. There was a lot of sloppy thinking all the way up to mid-20th century when George C. Williams wrote a book called Adaptation and Natural Selection, in which he really called attention to this issue. And the mantra, or the rule, which I call Williams' rule, in the paper that, thank you for reading it, we'll make it available, is basically group level adaptation, groups working, functioning well as groups, requires a process of group level selection and tends to be undermined by lower level selection process. You cannot say that a group is functionally organized, adaptively organized, unless you show that there's a process of between group selection. And because between group selection is only one force, not the only force, there's many, many examples in which groups are out there in nature, they're social groups, let us say, and they're not functionally organized. They're what we would call dysfunctional, despotic societies in which the powerful just subjugate the weak, and that's just the way it is. So we cannot be naive about attributing function. It does exist, it can exist, and of course from a policy perspective, we can bring it into being. So this is like the most important idea that you could have in terms of working to make things more functional at larger scales. But it's very hard won. We need to be able to recognize both the presence and absence of functional organization at whatever we're studying, human phenomenon, natural phenomenon. And that message, which I think is pretty well understood among evolutionary biologists, so basically thanks to Williams, then most evolutionary biologists are not naive about that anymore. And yet when we go outside of that, when we expand evolutionary thinking to include all human-related subjects, then you do find the same naivety, I want to say, that Williams addressed for evolutionary biologists. And so part of my missions in life is to just expand that awareness about multi-level selection and the relevance of multi-level selection. And then as we continue this conversation, I'm going to provide examples of how when we think about integrating evolutionary science and complex system science, then multi-level selection is what's part of what's still in progress. But now I'll take a breath and take a breath, David. Take a breath.
Yes, yes. Breathe, breathe. We need you to stay alive. So often people say that to me as well when I'm in a flow, and people say, breathe, Graham, breathe. If you carry on like that, you'll explode. So there are a couple of things there I want to pick up on, and then I'm going to bounce it back to you before I continue. So what we were alluding to, the question of ergodic versus non-ergodic dynamics, is time a trivial thing, or is time fundamental and you actually have to work with the path? Reading your paper on Williams, and in a moment I want to ask you to capture the two rules of Williams, the hard rule and the empirical rule. What really struck me reading that is, in addition to the assumptions that you mentioned, there are assumptions that we always make in any non-deterministic situation. What is the nature of randomness? Or more technically, what is the stochastic dynamics of the process we're dealing with? In other words, if something is sitting over here and it then changes to this state. So for example, you have a chicken over here that is somewhat aggressive, and over the course of a reproductive cycle, you have a new chicken emerging that is more aggressive. There is randomness happening in there. And whether that randomness has its basis in genetic combinations or whatever the vehicle may be is irrelevant. The question is, if you repeat that sequence multiple times, is each step in the sequence independent of the previous step, and it's just tossing a coin or throwing dice to figure out which possibility or probability out of the entire set of probabilities do you choose, and there's no connection? Or are we dealing with something where each successive event is deeply connected to the previous event, and you actually have to work with the path, because that's the nature of the stochastic dynamics? And the assumption that almost everybody was making in almost all of the disciplines until relatively recently is that you can ignore path-dependent stochastic dynamics and just work with the individual item. And my sense, and we'll come to this more deeply in a moment, is that as soon as you recognize that we actually have to work with the path, with the stochastic dynamics, the hard statement of Williams that you can only explain this with multi-level selection becomes a weaker statement, or a broader statement of multi-level selection is part of it, and another part of it lies in the difference between path-based statistics and path-independent statistics. In other words, full non-ergodic statistics and ergodic statistics. And maybe I'll say one more thing just to help people get a better understanding of what I'm talking about, and then I'll hand back to you for perhaps the two rules and where we go from here. if I take a very, very simple situation, you know, let's say that you have $1 in your bank account, and I say to you, let's play a game, and we'll keep playing this game for as long as you want. If I toss the coin and it lands heads, I'll increase your bank balance by 50%. And if it lands tails, you give me 50% of your bank balance. Now, it's perfectly clear on average, that's not going to change your bank balance. You know, if it increases to $1.50 or decreases to 50 cents and you take the average, it stays at $1. So that process stays on average at exactly $1. And the naive thinking, the thinking that the world is ergodic, would say, well, it's not actually going to make any difference to your bank balance. Just keep playing for long enough and you are guaranteed to trend towards the average. You just need to keep playing. Whereas actually, because the world is not ergodic, you do not trend to the average, you trend to below average. And if you play it in such a way that you toss the coin 5 times, by the 5th coin toss, of the 32 possibilities that you can end up off with after 5 coin tosses, 26 of them your bank balance is below average. Only 6 of them is your bank balance above average. So once you include the fact that this is non-ergodic, that the path matters, you realize that whilst the average is still $1, your most likely outcome is significantly below average.
Yep.
26 out of 32 paths
Yep.
are below average.
Well, yes, I thank you for this for our audience, and I'm familiar with this example, of course, but it's great that you laid it out for our audience. One of your canonical examples, and then the basis of a policy prescription, which has to do with income sharing. And we can return to that in a minute. And that includes, as we suggest papers for each other, the one by Ole Peters and Alexander Andemau on the ergodicity solution to the cooperation puzzle, which is all about this kind of example. So I want to return to that to illustrate some points. But I think that so I'm going to, like you, I'm going to agree with you in some respects and disagree in others. And in order to make it constructive, I think the bottom line is that these two bodies of knowledge are very complementary. In other words, we need them both. And so basically with evolution, we have complex systems evolving in complex environments. I mean, complexity both in the organism and in the environment with radical uncertainty, all of that. And so we definitely need to have both ultimate and proximate causation. But the way that gets handled, I think, and there's a lot of beauty or the devil in the details as to how that gets handled. And what I notice in general terms is very often an expectation that higher level adaptation, groups working well, or systems working well, will self-organize more than they will. And that my stance is that if we really want whole systems to work well, we have to be applying in a very conscious way variation, selection, replication algorithms at multiple scales and multiple contexts again and again and again. And in other words, we have to be thoroughly experimental would be a familiar way of putting it. And because we are working with complex systems, then of course we need to be taking that into account. And so, for example, this is exactly what you're doing, what you're trying to do. You're trying to get agents to form into a particular revenue and sharing agreement, which you can prove, you can demonstrate, is going to be better than if they just go it alone and play that game in a non-ergodic world. So you have a prescription, a policy prescription And that's why it's a good example. In order to put it into action, what are you going to have to do? How you have to get groups to do this, to agree to do with it. There's a cheater problem. There's a cheater problem. You have to have a regulatory apparatus. And here we're really talking about, the cultural evolution of a system in order to make this happen. And it will not self-organize otherwise. We should never think that it will. So there's where I think that Williams' rule becomes back in importance. Now, what was it that I wanted to say before we? Oh yes. So what I want to do now is to focus on, I think, the lack of integration and the need for integration, the current situation in terms of these two bodies of knowledge. And the way that I've done this, one way that I've done this is by focusing on the key term complex adaptive system, which is, of course, a key term, and to focus on two meanings of complex adaptive systems. One is a system that's actually adaptive as a system, and a multicellular organism would be a great example of that, as opposed to a system composed of agents following their respective adaptive strategies, and a laissez-faire economy, an unregulated laissez-faire economy would be an example of something like that. And what I find is that there is, and this surprised me, kind of a lack of appreciation of that distinction. And to demonstrate that, let me just read from, wait a minute. The Wikipedia entry on complex adaptive systems. So it says, typical examples of complex adaptive systems include climate, cities, firms, markets, governments, industries, ecosystems, social networks, power grids, animal swarms, traffic flows, social insect colonies, the brain and the immune system, the cell and the developing embryo, human social group-based endeavors such as political parties, communities, geopolitical organizations, war, terrorist networks are also considered CAS. And so what we find here is a intermixing of examples of systems that are obviously adaptive as systems, such as a social insect colony or an organism, and systems that are obviously agents in conflict with each other, and they're behaving adaptively as agents, like war or traffic flows, unless it's a well-regulated traffic flows. And so the distinction between CAS1 and CAS2, as we put it, is not made. It's not made. They're tone deaf if you were to go by that list. And then one final point before I take a breath, and it's an essay I wrote with Guru Madhavan, my good friend and systems engineer, in which what we did was we used the phrase complex adaptive system as a search term. We got over 1,000 hits. And then we used the phrase complex maladaptive systems as a search term. We got 0 hits. 0. Not a single one. And so the concept that a system can be complex, composed of agents that are following adaptive strategies, but be highly maladaptive as systems, it's not even a thing, Graham. It's not even a thing. The term complex maladaptive systems does not exist. Now, this is shocking. And so this is a degree to which I feel that, as much as I love complex system science, use it myself, appreciates its virtues, it is not making a very critical distinction here. And so I really want to know your impression on this.
Excellent. I'll put in a couple of thoughts. So, first of all, I'm equally amazed that the concept of a concept maladaptive system is not out there and being well researched. It ought to be, and many of the systems that we've built and are currently running in the institutions of modern society. Yeah. And by institution, I mean a body of agreements, not a thing.
Yeah.
Many of them, I would say that the evidence is very strong now that these are complex maladaptive systems. Now, the first that I want to put in is, let me say, maladaptive or beneficially adaptive is only is a statement you can only make according to some external frame of reference. So what is a complex maladaptive system in one frame of reference might be a complex beneficially adaptive system in another frame of reference. So we're now coming actually in human society deep into culture and belief paradigms. That's what defines whether something is deemed a maladaptive or an adaptive system. And I think that what's happening at the moment is that we have frames of reference that permeate our culture. And when I say our culture, I'm specifically meaning the culture that you and I grew up in, the Western or Anglo-Saxon culture. And these are frames of reference that, let's say, prize human agency over nature, human benefit over nature, that see these as two separate entities, along with many other aspects. And what this means is that I would say that what we have now is against the frame of reference of life itself thriving long term, including human life, we have a complex maladaptive system.
Very highly.
When you only look, say, over a few years or a couple of decades, maybe 1 century, and you're only looking from the frame of reference of human thriving, and everything else you're treating as an externality that you can neglect, then you would say it's a complex adaptive system. So that was the one thought I wanted to put in, is that the question of frame of reference. What are you comparing to when you make an evaluation? And what is your meta frame of reference that you use to determine whether that frame of reference is appropriate? And if it is appropriate, is it sufficiently comprehensive to capture everything that is important in your relevance? Yeah, that was the one thought. The other small thing I wanted to put in.
The first one was not small. Let me just correct you on that point. Now continue.
True, true. No, the other one was not small. This one is a small thing to say, but it's also extremely big in consequence. And you're well aware of this. If you think of the well-known videos of the murmurations of starlings, or on the computer, Conway's Game of Life, it's actually very easy to have phenomenally complex outcomes emerging from very, very simple rules of interaction between neighboring entities. And so what you were talking about, functional organization, self-organizing, I just want to put in as a complementary truth to what you were saying, that you can have very high levels of self-organization emerging bottom up from very simple rules of interaction. And that links back to the point I made at the beginning. So often we're only thinking of the system, and we're not actually looking at the interaction and the flows. And once you look at those two as completely distinct and inseparable, it becomes a lot more clear how you can have both, let's say, top down structures and functional organization emerging, as well as bottom up. And the two are not either or. It's not a contradiction, one or the other. It's a case of the two come together. You can have a top down and a bottom up. For instance, if I happen to be top down embedded in an ocean, I'm going to evolve in a different way to if I'm top down living on land in the air. Now, pause there and hand back to you to see where we
Yeah,
go
so
with
those are
this.
two big things. And to take them in reverse order, I think absolutely what we have without adaptation and natural selection at all, we do have the phenomenon that simple agents interacting with each other result in complex emergent uh, dynamics. So you get lots of pattern from that, but it's not adaptive pattern. It's computer art. The game of life gives you sliders and this and that, wonderful things that are happening. Nothing's adaptive in that system, and so we have to distinguish between pattern, which is wonderful pattern, and adaptive patterning that we would go by names such as immune system, physiology, anatomy, physiology, nervous system, which is really pattern um, with a purpose, pattern with a purpose. And of course, but natural selection is operating on complex systems. And so when you do find adaptive patterning, then the mechanisms have all of these emergent properties that we know and love. So I think that, but without natural selection, without a selection process, you get computer art. Okay?
Mm,
And to turn computer art into a real functioning organism, you need a selection uh, you need a selection process. And then that brings us to your first point about what counts as adaptive. And so, for example, we might think that we're developing a global system that's adaptive for humans, but stupid us, we left out the rest of life. And then, of course, that comes back to haunt us when it turns out that we actually relied upon the rest of life for our welfare. Or you might say that the
mm,
South Africa that you knew was working very well for the elites, for the
mm,
beneficial side. You call that adaptive. A slave society works well for the slave owner, um, uh, not for the slave, and not even for the slave society over the long run. And that's why, when you look at why the North won the Civil War, it's in part because the South, with its slave society, did not develop industry and so on. Basically, was structurally weak as a society compared to the industrial North. We have wonderful books on that, including a book called Making Democracy Work by Robert Putnam, when he studied the provinces of Italy at a time when Italy became less centralized and showed how different they were and how well they governed um,
mm,
um, themselves. And I think it is here's where multi-level selection becomes so important because what it shows is that what's functional at one level is disruptive at higher levels. I call it an evil alchemist a perverse alchemist that turns gold into lead. So self-preservation turns into self-dealing. Helping kith and kin becomes cronyism and nepotism. My nation first becomes international conflict. Strong economies becomes overheating the earth. Nearly every problem can be traced to a form of virtue, cooperation, at a lower scale. Very little is actually individually selfish. Most of the problems are uh, are caused by cooperative groups at smaller scales. And when you really take that on, then it leads to um, a strong conclusion that we must have the whole earth in mind. With this mandates, it demands a whole earth ethic. And if we're at all smart, then it has to be the rest of life on Earth, not just humans on Earth. We must act as stewards of life on Earth in addition to governing our own affairs. And everything under that must be coordinated with the global good in mind. And so what's under it? One thing that's under it are small groups. And then it's here where we can make a different point, which is that we evolved to live in small and for the most part highly cooperative groups. And so the kind of this cell of this multicellular organism is not really the individual. It's the individual embedded in small, purpose-oriented, and functionally organized groups. That's an insight which is almost totally lacking from neoclassical economics theory. We must work with groups, not just individuals. And then there's this so many meso-level identities that we have to work with. So that's basically the prescription. When we go about uh, trying to put this into action, that's exactly the kind of thing we do. That's like our toolkit that I was just beginning to describe. And so it'd be interesting to compare that with your toolkit, as inspired by complexity, but in particular this point that you were making with your coin toss experiment. I mean, this gives you a blueprint for, maybe you should describe this blueprint that you're working towards of how can we design economies that take this coin flipping dynamic to heart.
Excellent. I will come to that. I'm going to pick up on what you said about neoclassical economics and the group. One of the aspects of neoclassical economics is thinking of a human being in the economy as an economic agent. What's typically neglected, and where the group is essential, is nobody suddenly pops up into the economy as a fully functional, rational economic agent. There is a long process, and in modern society that may be 25 years. Birth, early childhood, teenage, late teenage and early 20s study before somebody gets to the point where they become part of the economy. And so any theory of an economy that does not look at the entire path to the point where somebody becomes active in the economy, then the path where they are fully active, both producing and consuming, and then the point where they retire and move into the third stage of their life, unless it looks at a person's life across that entire arc of their path from birth to death and treat that as the fundamental entity, not an economic agent here and now, it's missing critical things. And in particular, it's missing the role in the economy of parenting. It's missing critical roles in the economy of the role of grandparenting. Yeah, all of those are key.
Yeah.
Now, this links to the ergodicity question that we'll be coming to in a moment. So, you've read some of the papers by Peters and Adamo, you've read my book on ergodic investing and some other things. My sense is that as evolutionary science gets more and more inclusive of the question of should we be using the statistics for a non-ergodic dynamic, or can we safely assume ergodicity, the more we will see that many of the things that are currently only explained at a behavioral multi-level selection lens emerge as the self-centered, selfish behavior of individuals in a non-ergodic world, where the alternative to behaving that way is death. So Yes, there's multi-level selection that comes in because if you don't behave that way, you're all going to die. If you do behave that way, most of you will live. And that takes us back to this blend of cooperation and competition. I think that we will find in a few years' time, when we really look at evolution through the lens of non-ergodic dynamics, that yes, everything you're saying about selection between groups and multi-level selection, that dynamic is there, but it needs to be less powerful than is currently seen, because even within the group, this two-dimensional cooperation of capital pooling and competition, the complex dynamic of that along the path of each individual's trajectory connects self-interest with cooperation. It is in my self-interest to cooperate. In a sense, the more I cooperate, the more I cooperate with you, the better I can compete with you. Yeah, it sounds opposite, but it comes together. And where I'll tie it together. So everybody will recall the coin toss example I gave earlier, and that out of the 32 paths that somebody might go down after 5 coin tosses, 26 of those paths end up below average. In other words, almost every path that I take through life, you take through life, is most likely to end up below the average of all possible paths. There are 1 or 2 paths that are the outliers, which have a massive win. Almost everything else is below average. Now, to give an example of where this shows up is in professional poker playing, which is one of the luck-based gambling examples par excellence. Now, professional poker players follow this strategy. And the strategy is, when you're in a non-ergodic world, cooperation is the best competitive strategy between individuals. What that means is, in this coin toss example, the best strategy to maximize your individual chance of coming out ahead is to pool capital with all of the other players after every coin toss. Now, if I set things up at that very simple 50% gain or 50% loss, the outcome on average is 0 change. And your best chance, if you pool 100% of your capital at each coin toss, everybody will stay at 0.
Who does that in a poker game? I don't understand how this translates into a poker game strategy.
So let me come to poker now. So poker is something where the poker players are betting who will have a better hand. And if they have a better hand, they win. If they have a worse hand, they lose. Now, in professional poker playing, there's something that is called the expected value, which is, for a given poker player, their level of skill, etc., what would they expect to win long term if they keep playing? And so professional players come together into a pool, and they do an expected value pooling process. Everybody whose winnings are in excess of their expected value puts money into the pool, which is shared out across all of the members of the pool. And what that means is that all of the players tend to stay very close to their expected performance based on their real skill level.
So
It
if
gives them a
somebody's winning in poker, how that manifests is they just bet more because they've earned more? Is that how I'm just trying to just understand how that works in a group of
so
people that are playing poker hand after hand?
let's say where this really emerged is over the past couple of decades with online poker playing, where you might have 1,000 poker players that come together into a pool. They're all playing online with the commitment to put their excess winnings into this pooling mechanism. It's not something that you would necessarily do as just four poker players around a table one evening, although you might, but if it's just the four players, well, that doesn't really help. This in some senses is multi-level selection coming in again, because there is a level of competition within the pool, but there's a higher level of competition between pools. So, and the central idea is there is a lot of randomness in poker. You might on one day be winning heavily and on the next day be losing heavily, regardless of how good you are, just from the toss of the dice. And so it's very easy in a game like poker to get kicked out of the game. You go bankrupt.
Yeah, it's
You
just like
can't
your it's
play.
just like your coin toss example.
Yes, exactly. You go bankrupt, you can't come in again. So what this pooling mechanism does is it enables everybody to stay in the game for long enough for everybody's play to tend towards their, let's say, merit-based expected performance, the performance you would expect the person to deliver based on their skill at playing poker, rather than being excessively subject to the micro fluctuations that could lead a good poker player to be bankrupted for the next 2 years and a significantly less good poker player to just have a run of luck and stay in the game. And that is a recognition of the non-ergodic dynamics of poker, and the best selfish strategy to maximize your own individual winnings is to pool your profit with other players in your profit
Well,
pooling
this
syndicate.
allows me to make a point, and then follow it with another point, Graham, um, it's the distinction between absolute versus relative fitness, and a lot of the reasoning that goes is like what's my payoff if I do A compared to my payoff if I do B, and so basically we imagine the individual trying to maximize their absolute payoff, not comparing themselves to anyone else. The relative fitness metrics is that I want to do better than you. I mean, I could even do that by being spiteful. I want to be on top is what I want. I don't care about my maximum, my absolute payoff. I care on being the the one that's on top. And the economist Robert Frank makes this point well in his book, The Darwin Economy, where it says life is graded on a curve. The reason that I want to buy a $2,000 outdoor grill is not because it's because I want to lord it over you with a $500 grill and all of that. So I think that cancer is a great example of a relative fitness advantage. Cancer is a cell that's proliferating more than the neighboring cells. So it has a relative fitness advantage. It doesn't matter that the whole organism is going to die eventually. And so as soon as we shift to the relative fitness metric, it changes things a lot, especially in a game such as this, where that's not my point to earn as much as possible for myself, not comparing it to anything. I want to earn more than you, let us say, or maybe I don't. Maybe I don't care about the people in this, poker group. I really do want to leave the table with as much money as possible for myself. That's implicitly implying a multi-group population structure where the group that you're in at the moment is only one of many groups that you might be in. So I just want to flag this very root distinction between relative fitness thinking and absolute fitness thinking, and problematize the intuition basically, which is based on, and it manifests in like the concept of a win-win situation. If it's a situation where we're all win, shouldn't we all do it? Well, maybe, but where are the fitness differences in a win-win situation? There's no fitness differences there, and so therefore no evolution can take place in a group where everyone gets the same amount, either more or less. If there's, we have to look for differences, and so therefore, a group that's in a win-win dynamic is going to do better than a group that's not in a win-win dynamic. And so there's your difference. It's the difference is not within groups, it's between groups, um, and so on. And so I think that this is part of the intuition of multi-level selection, which is sometimes absent from other ways of thinking, which are more grounded in, and including neoclassical economics. The rational actor model assumes that individuals act to maximize their absolute utility. It's not comparative. And in fact, one reason is because it would make the math more difficult, back to an earlier uh, theme. So anyhow, I think what I want to do now is, in the first place, uh, emphasize that what we're working towards is uh, a real symbiosis between these two bodies of knowledge. And so even though we're disagreeing at some middle level, I think we both agree that in the first place, some combination of the two is paradigmatically different than neoclassical economics. So we're dealing with a new paradigm. One of the things you said is that the economy must be embedded. We can't study economic systems in some kind of isolation. It must be embedded. In your case, what you said is child development. Um, and so we must study economic systems embedded in social, political, environmental systems, whole cultures taking into account. So in the first place, um, we're dealing with a new paradigm here. That's exciting. That new paradigm will be an integration of evolutionary and complexity science, and we're not there yet. So we're on our way there, and that's what we're discussing, and that's what we're finding some things to disagree about. That's the way I think of it. So it's in a constructive enterprise. So that's how I look at it, anyhow.
Yes, absolutely. Um, Maybe I'll put in a thought here still about absolute versus relative fitness. Um, as you were talking, what I was hearing was absolute versus relative fitness as discrete probabilistic events. And that changes when you're looking at non-ergodic dynamics over time. Then the question is absolute versus relative fitness across the entire path. And that is the same question if randomness has a small effect. It's a completely different question when randomness has a big effect. That's where the difference between an ergodic path and a non-ergodic path, or ergodic versus non-ergodic dynamics, lead to very different outcomes. And that's where I would say what looks potentially counterintuitive in terms of relative fitness, when you're looking at it as if the world is ergodic and randomness has a small impact, is completely different when it's non-ergodic and randomness has a big impact. In other words, if we think of a village of people, that village of people is repeating the same gamble or competition every single day for 70, 80 years that the people are alive, and for generation after generation. And in that case, it's, even if I might be stronger than you and able to kill you to take your wealth, I'm not going to do it, because by the end of that process, I might have killed everybody in the village, taken all of their wealth, and then I die myself.
Well, that's like a
So,
cancer, by the way.
yes, it's exactly
And
like a
cancers don't
cancer.
say, "Oh my gosh, if this keeps on going, we'll all die." They don't do that. They just
Yeah,
proliferate. And so, just to make that point, the idea that the whole system comes crashing down is no argument against the fact that evolution is based on differentials, and it does not have foresight. So, in your own example, the idea that some individual will do something that brings about that person's destruction as part of the whole system, that's like evolution has no foresight. It's what we're doing as we speak. So anyhow,
Yes, yeah, it definitely is what we're doing. Um, and that's where I wouldn't say that evolution has foresight, but what natural selection does is it kills off everything that has a suboptimal relative strategy over the entire path. So my what I'm saying is that when we look at evolution with the full implications of this high volatility, high impact of randomness, and the non-ergodic path, like cancer, everything that does not cooperate sufficiently across the path dies off. And cooperation emerges as a self-centered, emergent phenomenon once you look at it over the entire path, which is then also the point now in our business world. We have this ideology that pure competition is the solution to everything because neoclassical economics is blind to the non-ergodic dynamics. And it's naively borrowed from simplistic evolutionary thinking. And now when we bring in the full complexity of what you've been saying, multi-level selection, Williams rules, when we bring in the complexity of what I've been saying from Margaret Archer, of the importance of never conflating interactions into systems, nor conflating systems into interactions, but treating the two together. Once we bring all of that in, it becomes perfectly clear that the reason why we have a maladaptive complex maladaptive system, is because we've not seen clearly the key dynamics that are at play. And so we're doing exactly what nature does with a cancer. It dies off, or with a maladaptive species, it dies off.
yeah. So all good. I want to say. I guess what I want to say is that I think that there's a point of difference between us, which is interesting to explore and to highlight. And I think that let's imagine one thing that always exists is that uh, evolution, genetic or cultural evolution, takes place in uh, multi-group populations. It's always the case that a large population is divided into multiple groups. Interactions are taking place within groups and between groups. These are just biological and cultural facts of life. That's just the way it is. No theory can afford to ignore the fact that evolution takes place in what we call meta populations. And so if we could imagine in the real world or in computer simulations, we cause the dynamics to be ergodic. Then we get certain outcomes. We get certain differentials within groups, certain differentials between groups. Now we make the interactions non-ergodic, and we get more complex dynamics within groups and between groups. It's still the case that we have these differentials operating at different scales. And so I sometimes sense in the comments that you've been making is that multi-level selection is kind of assuming ergodicity, and that when we add non-ergodicity, then that's something which is outside multi-level selection. And I want to say that when we add non-ergodicity, of course it changes the dynamics hugely, but there's still multi-level selection taking place. There's still differentials within and between groups. So there's a point that I'm just happy to have made, and maybe I could ask you to comment on that, and we could wrap up in a few minutes because we've had a wonderful time for the last hour and a half so far and counting.
Yes. So I completely agree with everything that you've just said. And if my words left the impression of disagreement with what you've just said, I apologize for that. That's back to what we were saying earlier. Language is all we have to point at concepts, but the words I'm saying are not the concepts I'm pointing at. So completely agree. We absolutely have to have multi-level selection. or alternately said, we have to have competition as well as cooperation. It's not an either or case. More the point I'm making is, as I was reading your paper on Williams, some of the statements in there which were, let me say, cast as an extreme statement, as a binary statement, I'm saying once you bring in to the thinking that the dynamics of life are non-ergodic, not ergodic, and what I'm picking up in what I understand of evolution is that much, if not all, of the evolutionary thinking up until about maybe 10, 20 years ago was implicitly assuming ergodicity. It wasn't even aware that it was assuming
Yeah,
it.
yeah.
And so everything needed to be explained within that assumption. And once you let go of that assumption and recognize the non-ergodic dynamics, the entire body becomes now adds another dimension to
I
it.
agree. Let me call
And
out a book, Graham, in preparation for this conversation, because we have done quite a bit of talking, kind of informal preparation for this conversation. But there was a book published way back in 1996, which seems like a long time ago, by David Depew and Bruce Weber. The title is Darwinism Evolving, Systems Dynamic and the Genealogy of Natural Selection. And their point is that Darwinism has been reinvented 3 times. In Darwin's formulation, it was quite mechanical. And then it became probabilistic. That's what population genetics came. And now the third generation of natural selection is based on systems dynamic. And so Depew and Weber were saying that in 1996. And so I think that, which is of course within the last 50 years. And I think that's correct. And I think that that's basically the point that you're making, is that when we reformulate Darwinism, including multi-level selection plus more, in complex systems turn, there will be a transformation compared to earlier versions, which were probabilistic or mechanical. So isn't that interesting?
I think it's absolutely spot on. I appreciate the clarity of that sequencing in time of the evolution of the discipline gives. Because what I would now say is the middle phase of probabilistic was implicitly assuming ergodic behavior of the
Yeah.
probabilities. And what we're now saying is that we need to bring in actually its non-ergodic dynamics for the probabilities, and that changes the consequences of a probabilistic component.
Yeah, and so this actually enables me to raise a point that was also raised in your conversation with Steve Keen and friends, um, which is that sometimes it seems that the way you and others describe it, the goal appears to be to take a non-ergodic system and to make it ergodic, and so it becomes the ergodic economy. Whereas I think another way of thinking of it is that our systems will always be non-ergodic. We just have to work with non-ergodic systems. Sometimes we gain by making them ergodic, but at other times we just cannot do it, wouldn't want to do it. We just have to learn how to work with non-ergodic systems. And so well, I'm glad that I could pose that question to you and to have you answer it here.
Yes, let me tie that together. It's a superb question. And it comes back to what you were saying a few minutes ago about fitness, absolute versus relative fitness. And in the typical capital dynamics that are relevant in business and in life, recognizing that the dynamics for any individual any individual living entity, any individual business, those dynamics are non-ergodic. And the expected outcome, think back to the coin toss example I gave earlier, the expected outcome over the path of a business's life or an individual living entity's life, the expected outcome is significantly below average in a non-ergodic world. So the average gives the upper limit of what you can expect to happen. Now, if the world is ergodic, the expected outcome of the path and the average are identical. There's no difference. So in that sense, the closer your strategy is to restoring ergodicity versus another species or another business, the better your relative fitness. So by striving to re-establish ergodicity, that is the same as saying striving to increase your relative fitness versus another business or another species.
Okay. Okay. If we took, here's just a pair of questions to further explore this space. Let's say we took a physiological process like temperature regulation.
Mm-hmm.
We understand that well mechanistically. Is it ergodic or non-ergodic? What would a regulatory system like that, well, how would we classify it?
That's an interesting question. Um, so first of all, the question of ergodic or non-ergodic is relevant if there is some kind of unpredictability, randomness, or stochastic dynamics. So where this may require a lot of deeper thinking and may require some experts in temperature regulation, and maybe you have this expertise to come in. But that is probably in many situations, let's say neither ergodic nor non-ergodic because there's not much randomness coming in.
Okay.
But where,
Let me follow it with another one,
where
Graham. So think of an evolutionary process, uh, a variation, selection, replication process. Let's say an individual, because evolution can be a personal process. B.F.
mm,
Skinner talked about selection by consequences. So think of an organism that's striving for something, and that's basically a variation, selection, replication process. And so it learns, it climbs some kind of learning curve and does it. So there you have variation. Is that an ergodic or a non-ergodic process, or are we actually kind of in the same way as with a temperature regulation process? Well, wait a minute,
right.
hard to classify that.
Yes. So typically that will be non-ergodic. Where non-ergodic comes in is, and this is what I was looking for, the linkages with temperature regulation. Where non-ergodic comes in is anything that is to do in some sense with growth or accumulation or something like that.
Yeah,
So the link with temperature regulation where a non-ergodic dynamic comes in is, for example, for hibernating individuals, how much fat do they accumulate during the summer months so that they have the energy reserves they need to hibernate and come out of hibernation successfully?
right.
That is clearly non-ergodic, especially then with the big question of, which is relevant now with the climate emergency coming in, what happens if there's a heat wave in early January
Yeah,
and they come out of
yeah,
hibernation and there's no food to eat and then it goes cold
yeah,
again and they die if they can't go back into
yeah,
hibernation. Yeah, that's completely non-ergodic. And this is then where, let me give you a simple instance. If you have a species that hibernate alone, and this is the change that is happening in randomness, versus species that hibernate as a
yeah,
community of
yeah,
animals. Yeah. If they're hibernating as a community of animals, they have the ability to pool stored
yeah,
food, the ability to pool warmth and maintain a temperature for hibernation and an ability to survive until the spring arrives. If they do come out of hibernation, they have much more ability to maintain that for everybody if they're hibernating
yeah,
together rather than as isolated
Yep, yep.
individuals.
And there's wonderful biological examples, which Oli Peters in the article that we've read and I'll reference cites geometric mean fitness and that kind of thing. I'd like to channel my colleague Stephen C. Hayes and his work on non-ergodic systems. Um, he is the founder of acceptance and commitment therapy and training, so he's a pillar. His work is a pillar of what we do. But he has a personal story behind it. His son, he's written about this, so I'm happy to
Mm.
share this information. Stevie had a muscular disorder as a child, which really made it seem as if he would never be able to engage in strenuous physical activities. And so on the bell curve, he was way out on the low end, and it was more or less, the message was you can't do anything about this. This is just a condition. But Steve and his wife didn't accept that, and so they got a coach that was really worked with, was willing to, uh, and of course it was hard work. It's not as if you could, it's not as if Stevie didn't have this condition, but the fact was that with enough hard work and the right kind of work, he was actually able to become a black belt in karate. And Steve thinks of this as like, first of all, the whole mentality that goes into traditional statistics and which locates you on some kind of a bell curve as if that's your place and there's no way that you can change your position on the bell curve as ergodicity, and that treating any person in this case as a much more evolutionary system as a form of non-ergodicity. And so what he's been doing now is quite apart from his son is just really reformulating clinical psychology from on this basis. And what it means is that if each individual is their own dynamic system, the only way that you can study that is by taking time series data on each and every individual. You need to just follow those individuals through time. And then you need to understand them as their own dynamical system. And then there's some aggregation as possible. There's some things you can say at the group and population levels, but only after you understand each individual as their own dynamical system using time series data, and he's developing apps to do that. So I think that I think I've represented that pretty well. Does that map pretty well onto your understanding of ergodicity? What do you have to say about that enterprise? And of course, I can provide links to what Steve's doing.
Yes, it maps absolutely perfectly. So one of the things or the products that we have in our Evolutesix ecosystem, we call the adaptive way, which is how do I interact with myself? How do I mediate the voices in my head? How do I interact with other people in a way where we can harness the tension as an impulse for growth, for development? And acceptance and commitment theory influences that. Now, where this comes in, one of the key elements of the adaptive way, first of all, is that recognition that I am a complex system and that aspects of myself that I might want to get rid of. For example, myself, I have had, depression has been a part of my life ever since my early teens. And when I was younger and less mature and wise, I thought, oh, I wish I could get rid of my depression completely. Well, it's become so clear to me as I look at my life as a path, and that it's the entire path of my life from birth to death that matters, not me at any given instant. It's become perfectly clear to me that the biggest strength I mentioned at the beginning, my creativity, is just the flip side of the same muscle that leads to depression, which is a deep felt sense of the gap between what could be and what currently is. So there's absolutely no way that I would ever want to get rid of my depression, because I would lose the achievements that I'm most proud of as well. So what I was hearing in what you were saying with Steve, so absolutely, we have to look at ourselves and other people as the entire path. In addition to that, we have to look at ourselves, and this is where Ubuntu in Southern Africa is so clear. We are not isolated paths, no matter how much we would like to be. I am because you are. If something happens to me, let's say if I commit a crime, well, we actually need to put the entire community that I'm embedded in on trial to figure out what is it in the entire context that led me to commit a crime. There's really good research out there, for instance, that shows that winning a Nobel Prize, yes, you have to have a certain minimum level of competence to have any chance of winning a Nobel Prize. But once you're above that threshold, the difference between the person that wins and the 999 people that don't win lies in randomness. It's not something that you deserve, and the people who didn't win didn't deserve it.
Yeah. Steve Frank
So
has a
this,
book on that, by emphasizing luck, by the way. So just to shout out that book, but keep going.
yes, excellent. So the example that you gave with Stephen and his son, what struck me listening to that is his son was not isolated. His son was part of a
Oh
family,
boy.
and there
And
was a lot of pooling of human capitals, financial capitals, etc., that meant that his son whilst it was highly non-ergodic, that his son, out of thousands of sons born at the same time, had this muscular disorder. That was not something that his son worked hard to get or whatever. It was a toss of the coin. And it was the capital pooling that took what could have been a declining path way back up towards the ergodic maximum.
and also an evolutionary process. I mean, there was a goal, there was a target of selection. We were doing this, and we were trying this, we were trying that. If that didn't work, we tried something else. And so there was
Yes.
a variation selection replication process that was driving it in that direction. So I think that's actually might be a pretty good way to end as to the combination of an evolutionary worldview and a complex systems worldview.
Yes.
And so I think that it's conversations such as this that's going to accomplish this integration. I think it could happen quite randomly. The more we basically
Hmm.
have this conversation, this type of conversation amongst the two bodies of knowledge. And also, I'd like to end by saying stressing the importance of learning by doing and not just having conversations like this, but also projects in which we're actually trying to accomplish positive change in the real world using our tools, both at the table. So basically, pooling. Here's another form of pooling for you. Um,
Hmm.
our intellectual resources, and then it's by actually applying them that will be the fastest way to winnow them um, and combine
Yes.
them. So cultural recombination. So I think that I hope that those who are listening to this, if they can um, identify any opportunity to put these ideas into practice, then our respective organizations, Pro-Social World, Evolutesix, and other organizations that we're attempting to coordinate can actually, that's what catalysis is all about. So throwing out some key words there.
Yes, exactly. Completely on that page. You know, I'm very much a practitioner. The economy, nature, it's all a sequence of actions connected by a path. This is not, there's no point in sitting on the side of a mountain in a cave contemplating things but doing nothing. Yeah, and especially now with everything that's happening, this is more than ever the time for action. And as I think it was Peter Drucker put it, there is nothing better than a solid theory to guide the most effective action.
Yeah, yeah. And I want to bring back spirituality, which has been kind of a side actor in this, but I think needs to be central. And the fact that we've been mostly speaking in a scientific idiom, but we did bring in, you did bring in spirituality early on, and all of this can be discussed in a spiritual idiom as well. And that to be able
Mm,
to be bilingual, you might say, and to be able to not just express but to feel, because heartfelt in addition to um, cerebral, um, to think and do in a spiritual way, along with a scientific way, I think is something that's part of what we're working towards. And what could be better than that? So I think that that's part of what's on the agenda is to be able to do that. Well, I'll give you the final word, Graham. So you get to wrap it up. Except I'm going to thank you very much for this great conversation. Can't wait to share it. And then so again,
wonderful, David. Well, also great thanks to you. I have thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. You know, as with so many of our conversations, the conversations that each of us have with other people, the differences, the tensions between us, like in surveying, are two different perspectives on the same thing that enable us to see it more
yeah,
clearly.
yeah. I think
So,
one
thoroughly,
thing about this conversation is we disagreed quite a bit, but we did so
yes,
in a constructive way. And so I think that that is science is a process of constructive disagreement is one of my definitions of of science. And I feel I'd like to think, not to pat ourselves on the back too strongly, that we did a bit of that in this
yes,
conversation.
definitely, we definitely did. And what I'm really looking forward to is our conversation in 10 years' time, after we've put everything we've been saying into action, and many, many, many other people and a lot of money has been putting this into action in the economy, and we see the beneficially complex adaptive system that we develop over the next decade.
Could we shrink that to 3 years time, Graham?
Let's shrink it to 3 years' time.
Okay. Okay. So any enablers out there, you know who to call. So thank
Yeah.
you, Graham. This has been great. Thank you so much.
And thank you, David.